Today we are really excited to have Lucy Sussex with us. Dr. Lucy Sussex is a creative writer and a scholar of 19th century literature, and I love that she's been described as a literary archaeologist, where she deftly interlaces witty storytelling with exhaustive research. Lucy is the author of the novel The Scarlet Rider, the non-fiction work Women Writers and Detectives in 19th Century Crime Fiction, the Mothers of the Mystery Genre. Lucy has also produced 5 short story collections, including My Lady Tongue, A Tour Guide in Utopia, Absolute Uncertainty, and the beautifully titled Matilda Told Such Dreadful Lies. Lucy's lecture today will concern her latest book, Blockbuster, Fergus, Hume and The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, which is also being sold down the back by our friends Adam Biggin. Thank you very much.
And thank you for that intro. Well, what I'm talking about, the title today is the genesis of Australian crime fiction. And I thought, well, it actually helps to put this book on Fergus Hume's Mystery of the Hansom Cab into context by considering what he was working in, and that is 19th century Australia. And his book was written just short of the centenary of white settlement. And so what's the genesis of Australian crime fiction? Well, people were interested in crime and what we call true crime from the very beginning, for a very simple reason, because the place began as a penal colony. And so most of the initial settlers were indeed subject matter for crime. They had done various things, ranging from very small to major, and they had been transported for their sins to Australia. And some of this can be seen. There was a lady novelist called Louisa Meredith who operated in Tasmania, and she found herself in a rural inn with nothing to read. So she went around and looked around and was told, oh, there's only one book in the house. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, you'd expect this would be the Bible. In fact, it was the Newgate Calendar, which was a compendium of true crime, prisoners from Newgate Prison in England, which was a bestseller. So Louisa Meredith was rather disgusted by this and didn't read it, but lots of people did. And so the matter of true crime is very much present from at the beginning of the colonial times. And here we get into a little bit of Melbourne versus Sydney rivalry. The first Australian-born novelist was a man called John Lang, and he's also the first Australian crime novelist. It's hardly surprising that he was the grandson of a First Fleet convict, a Jewish man who was, among his careers, he was included being a policeman. And John Lang was an interesting character. He created trouble wherever he went, and so he travelled around the world, ending up in India. And he started to write about Sydney and the crime of Sydney in the mid-century, when Australia becomes of interest to people who are emigrating because of the goldfields. So there's interest in the matter in Australia and England, so there's a market. So he starts writing about the Sydney that he knew and grew up with, and he comes up with the first. Not only does he write Fisher's Ghost, which is a very famous ghost story in which the ghost reveals whodunnit, the ghost of the murdered man, but he also writes the first Australian fictional detective, and this was based on a real character called Israel Chapman, who was, like Lang's grandfather, both a convict and a policeman, and also Jewish. In Lang's book, The Forger's Wife, Chapman appears as George Flowers, and he's a thief-taker. Now, a thief-taker was more or less like a bounty hunter than anything else, but it acts very much like a detective in that he's looking for criminals. And you can say that George Flowers is the first Australian fictional detective, although if you look at The Forger's Wife, it's not really a whodunnit. It hasn't got that form. It's more a series of crime adventures with a bit of romance thrown in. And so, following Lang, we now move to Melbourne, and about sort of 1865. And around about January 1865, a regional newspaper, the Hamilton Spectator, has what is probably the first Victorian, as in the colony Victorian detective story. And it's called Wonderful When You Come to Think of It, and it appears in the local paper, the Hamilton Spectator. And it's signed MC. And it so happens that in the vicinity of Hamilton, working on a station, was a young man called Marcus Clarke, a very clever young man, a teenager then, but there's every evidence that Marcus Clarke, who later went on to write his Natural Life, did write Wonderful When You Come to Think of It, which is a sort of spoof detective story, and that would make it the first Victorian detective story. And then what happens in September of that year is that a magazine starts, the Australian Journal, which is published by a printing firm in 72 Little Collins Street. In fact, there ought to be a plaque up. And it has its first issue, and in that the first 6 pages are almost exclusively crime fiction. Not only, which is possibly due to the fact that their editor, George Wolstead, was a former policeman, but also that the editors of the magazine and the proprietors knew very well that crime paid in terms of selling magazines. So it began with a story called The Shepherd's Hut. Not a very good story, it's sort of like an action adventure. A detective goes out to arrest a bushranger in Bundoora, and somehow or other the author, James Skip-Paules, didn't seem to know that when going to Bundoora, you don't go via Flemington. Not a very good story, but there was one, but in the same issue was the first instalment of a serialised novel called Force and Fraud by a woman called Mrs. Arthur Davitt. And she'd been very much involved with what became Melbourne High. And she was at one stage the senior woman in secular education in Victoria, but jobless and widowed by the 1860s, she turned to literature. A very strong, feisty character, a really interesting woman, and her Force and Fraud is the first known Australian mystery novel. It hasn't got a detective, so you can't call it as a detective novel, but it's being reissued very shortly by Clandestine Press in an e-edition, and there's postcards for that up the back. Another interesting thing about Ellen Davitt is that she wrote a story called The Highlander's Revenge, and which will also be included in the e-edition, and talk about true crime in Australia. She must at some stage have encountered a witness to the 1840s massacres of Aboriginals in Gippsland, because she describes a very similar incident in The Highlander's Revenge, and she must have, and it's so accurate that she must have spoken to somebody who was there. So a very direct link there. So the Australian Journal started, and they discovered that crime paid, and Ellen Davitt's series finished. But other writers came along, and one of them was a woman called Mary Fortune. And like Wolstead, the editor, she knew a good deal about crime because she'd married an Australian policeman bigamously after having run away from her first husband in Canada and turned up on the goldfields. And she was a bit of a wild lady, knew the crime scene from the policeman's viewpoint, but also the criminal viewpoint. And sadly for her, her son George was a career criminal and spent 20 years of his life in jail. Mary Fortune herself was at one stage wanted by police for being an involuntary witness in a case of rape. And we don't know what happened in that case, but we do know that they put out an APB because they were looking for her, and so that we learn that she was tall, pale, thin, and wore black. You know, typical Melburnian. But the interesting thing about Mary Fortune is that she writes 500 stories in her detective albums series, and they're narrated by a detective policeman. And this is goes on from the 1860s to 1909, so it's the longest known detective fiction series worldwide. No other 19th century writer, and certainly no other woman writer, writes 500 stories over a 40-year period consistently, once a week and then once a month. Quite an extraordinary individual, and certainly Fergus Hume knew all about her, because when he came to Melbourne in 1885, her son George was arrested for bank robbery, and it was all over the papers. And now to Fergus Hume. Well, how to have a blockbuster novel success and not make any money might be the story of his life. And just a few things about the book. You can see on the screen. First edition was Melbourne in 1886, late 1886. It was claimed the edition was 5,000 copies, and that's quite extraordinary for a colonial novel at the time. Melbourne's population was under 500,000 people. It was the largest city in Australasia, and certainly one of the richest cities in the world. It had a huge reading population. Even in the 1860s, it was noted that Melburnians had a huge appetite for books. But at the time, there were a few publishers. There were lots of bookstores. There were a few publishers, but generally colonial editions were small. It's been estimated that probably about 200 copies was the usual, and certainly for a first novelist who hadn't been heard of before, 5,000 copies was huge. And particularly since this was a crime novel, and while crime had been in serials in the Australian Journal, there weren't that many crime novels about, with the exception of His Natural Life, which is about the convicts and been published in the 1870s. Anyway, 5,000 copies, which is actually still big for an Australian novel even today, when there's so much more distractions like the internet and film and things like that. But it very quickly sells out, and so they print new editions, and it's said that they have 5,000 copies sold in Australasia. That's interstate, New Zealand. Hume originally came from New Zealand. Within about a year. Then, and there's 2 subsequent editions. Then the idea is English publishers start putting out feelers saying we'd like to buy the copyright. And Hume's publisher, a man called Trishna, decides that, well, maybe it would be a good idea to publish in London. And he does. And that's, and what they end up with is an absolute blockbuster. 25,000 copies a month for 14 months, and it's the biggest and fastest selling detective novel of the 1800s. And there's a picture of Hume looking very dapper. He was well known as a smart dresser with the typical handlebar moustache, and that's the original cover. Note that it says a sensational Melbourne novel, because Trishna had noted that Melburnians, even in 1886, liked reading about themselves. This was the cover that was used in London and Melbourne, with the address of the publishers changed. And it was sold as a Melbourne novel, even in London. Such was the success of Golden Melbourne, which was very much a boom time city. Marvellous Melbourne was coined during this time. And there you can see the Hansom Cab, the Belvedere Tower of Government House, going down St Kilda Road, the murder taking place, but the driver not knowing who done it because he's up at the back and high up, so he can't see what's going on inside the cabin. And so a mystery is created. So a few things about Hume. He was born in 1859 within 6 weeks of Arthur Conan Doyle, who would become his great rival in the field of crime writing. He's literally born in a lunatic asylum because his father was an attendant and they lived on the premises. In 1861, the family migrate to Dunedin, New Zealand. They're Presbyterians. It's a Presbyterian colony, but there's also huge gold finds in Otago. And by that, they therefore move from the working class to the middle class, because in Otago, the lunatic asylum keeper leaves, and Hume's father, James, has had decades of experience. He's not a qualified doctor, but he's very skilled in moral management, which is a humane and quite successful way of treating the insane. And he gets the job of keeper of the mental asylum. And so, again, they live on the premises. So he grows up in a lunatic asylum, and, you know, what a superb basis for a crime writer. You'll know all about abnormal psychology. And when he's about 14, he reads The Count of Monte Cristo and decides he wants to be a writer. He's also particularly intrigued by theatre. Dunedin is on the provincial theatre circuit. There's all sorts of international acts passing through, but there's also, and moral management is also about occupational therapy and the influence of the arts seen as beneficial to people who are mentally afflicted. And so there's music, but there's also theatrical performances within the asylum, and so there's troupes who come in and perform. So Fergus grows up with the theatre and decides he wants to be a playwright. But his father, who is appalled by this suggestion, says, and I won't do a Scotch accent, you know, laddie, get yourself a profession first. So he goes to Otago Boys High School, which is literally next door, and then he goes to Otago University, and he qualifies as a lawyer, somewhat against his will. But again, what a marvellous basis for a crime writer. But before he qualifies, he produces a novel serialised in a Dunedin newspaper anonymously called Professor Brankel's Secret, and it's a sensational tale of bibliographic search for a hidden formula that will give eternal life, and involving time travelling, drug taking, and attempted virgin sacrifice. No wonder he published it anonymously, and then a few months later he graduated as a lawyer. Almost immediately publishes a poem under his own name in the local papers about the death of Wagner. A perfectly dreadful poem, but you know, he's throwing down the gauntlet. He's saying, I want to be a writer. And he's quite successful in that he manages to get his plays produced in New Zealand, not only by visiting Australian troupes, but by an English troupe. And that's the impetus for him to go to seek his fortune in Melbourne. And he takes his sister Mary with him, and she's a operatic soprano. Mary's bad luck is that she finds herself competing with Nellie Melba. And Fergus's bad luck is that he can't get the local theatre producers. J.C. Williamson had pretty much a monopoly to take him on. And so he thinks, well, how can I get people to take me seriously as a writer in Melbourne? And he's only been there, you know, a few months. And so he thinks, why don't I write a novel? That people will take me seriously if I write a novel and I get it published. So he goes to a local bookstall and says, what's selling? And the bookseller says, oh, the novels of Émile Gaboriau, who's a French writer who's been translated. And the importance of Gaboriau is that he pretty much invented the police procedural. So Hume goes and buys all of Gaboriau's novels, and he reads them all. And he's going to a party down St Kilda Road, and he says he has the idea of a murder in a hansom cab because the driver can't see what's going on, and it would be perfectly possible to murder somebody there and get away with it. And so he also had the idea of a novel written by a follower of Gaboriau called the Murder in an Omnibus. So, you know, omnibus, public transport, Hansom Cab. Lateral thinking there. And so he sits down and he writes a novel while working as a law clerk all the time, running a practice. And he writes the novel, and he very carefully plots it. So he understands that crime writers need to plot very carefully. He also understands the importance of locale, that the city is very much a character in a crime novel. So you think about the Edinburgh of Ian Rankin, the London of Sherlock Holmes. So he makes Melbourne almost a character in the story, and he depicts it. So he writes the first draft, and then he looks at it and he thinks the villain's too obvious. So he rewrites it again with an added villain, and then he starts shopping it around. He took it to various publishers. We know that Wardlock, an English publisher, had an office in Melbourne at that time, and he would have taken it there. And they turned him down. He went to George Robertson, who was the biggest colonial publisher in Melbourne. But Robertson was a strict Presbyterian, and Robertson objected to the low life, because humour included not only high society but the slums of Little Lonsdale and the opium dens in that area, and a good deal of what Robertson considered bad language, blast, damn. Robertson took a fairly short time to reject it because it was just too daring and might encourage the youth of Melbourne to visit these low-life locales. So Fergus is a bit despondent, and he runs into Fred Trishna. And I'll just put up briefly some of Hume's own opinions on crime writing to show how seriously he took it, because this was not something he approached lightly. He was very conscientious, and he put everything he had into the Hansom Cab. His observations of Melbourne, musical life. It was advertising him, so it advertised that he was a witty literary man, that he was cultured, that he knew music, that he knew literature, and that he knew the theatre. And then later on he was disgusted to be dismissed as a pulp author, because the Hansom Cab is in fact a literary novel. It's not only a crime novel, it's a literary novel. And that's partly why it's endured. It's very seldom been out of print. But Hume's publisher, Fred Trishna, Frederick Alfred Shepherd Trishna, whose initials were Fast, and indeed he was a bit of a fast worker. Trishna was English. He'd been a merchant seaman. He came to land in Christchurch, New Zealand, and did various things, including speculating on the stock market and becoming a cornbroker, and went bankrupt. He moves to Melbourne. He gets a job with a small publisher called Inglis. He then moves to America, works with another publisher called Bancroft's, and when their premises burned down, he comes back to Melbourne just in time to encounter Hume, who has this manuscript going begging. And a few dates of Trishna. His life, quite an extraordinary character. Possibly the most important thing about him is that he worked in Melbourne as an advertising canvasser, so he understood the significance of advertising. A few statements from Trishna, his statements of intent. He believed in paying royalties. Not all publishers did at that stage. And he also believed that books are articles in commerce, and if they were literature, but it didn't matter, just as long as they sold. So he was a very commercially minded publisher ahead of his time. So that's his statements of intent. How did he sell so many copies? Well, he's the driving force behind it. He goes and they raise the money to effectively self-publish. They self-publish through a printer. They raise the money by speculating on the stock market with hints from a friend of Hume's who was called Alice Cornwell, who was like the 19th century equivalent of Gina Reinhardt. She was a gold mining magnate in Ballarat, and she hadn't actually made much money then, but she advised them what shares to buy. So they raised the money and they printed this big edition. And they very cleverly brought it out during Melbourne Cup week when the population of Melbourne exploded. And indeed, I wouldn't put it past Hume and Trishna to be selling it at the Melbourne Cup, because 150,000 people went to the 1886 Melbourne Cup. It was perfect weather. And even if they weren't selling at the Cup, they would have had it in railways, they would have had it at the railway bookstores, and every railway had them. And they would also had them at Coles Picture Book, Coles Book Arcade in Burke Street, which always opened on Cup Day because the business was so brisk. People would go and punt, and then they'd come back to the city, and they'd want to have a cup of tea and a nice book to read. How did they sell so many copies in London? Hume unfortunately sold his copyright for £50, quite a good sum in those days. But poor man, he didn't believe that a Melbourne novel would sell well in London. He was very much a product of the cultural cringe. Trishna, on the other hand, did have faith, and he joined forces with a couple called George Taylor and his wife Jessie. Jessie bought the copyright. She was a very keen businesswoman in the Melbourne boom time period, and her husband ran a bank. He ran the commercial bank in Melbourne, and so they financed the London push. Trishna and Jessie went to London and they set up offices and they started printing. They got a printing press and they started printing and they advertised. Oh boy, did they advertise. This was in the editorial section, and advertorial, and this more or less appeared in just about every British newspaper they could lay hands upon. And a huge amount of money would have been involved, and in fact the evidence is that the Taylors defrauded the commercial bank. And in fact in the Melbourne land boom crash of the 1890s, George Taylor's bank went bust. He was found to have defrauded it and he went to jail. Jessie, however, ran off to America with what proceeds she could lay hands on. But that's an entirely different story. They made a lot of money in a very short time. And Trishna and Hume fall out, most unfortunately. And so Hume takes himself off to another publisher. Trishna sets up his own publishing company and publishes his own work. Trishna and Company, this is one of his authors, Lady Colin Campbell, a sensational divorcee, but also a novelist and journalist, friend of George Bernard Shaw and Whistler. Interesting woman, but her book didn't make much money for Trishna and Company. Some of their other authors, Rosa Praed, very well-known Queensland authors. Robert Sherard, Man in Glasses, who was a biographer and defender of Oscar Wilde. And in the centre, a man called Benson, who was famous for spending an entire fortune, his industrialist father's fortune, millions and he spent it all in 2 years. And so he did a ghost-written book which unfortunately sank from us like a stone and took much of Trishna's profits with it, and in fact Trishna went bankrupt, and his firm was closed down after about 70 books. So how are we going for time? A little bit more? Oh well. Other products of the Hansom Cab. Well, Hume went on to write 140 books, never quite the same success. But there were 3 films, 3 silent films, all of them lost. The first one would have been really interesting because it was made by the makers of the Kelly Gang. The second one was by a man called Arthur Shirley, who tried for years to get a talkie up. And this is some stills from his version in the mid-1920s. And he's playing a role there, and that's Madame Guttersnipe's lair. The third film was in England in 1915, and that was by a man called Elliot Stannard, who very interestingly went on to work with Alfred Hitchcock. So if you can think of Hume influencing Hitchcock, that's the link. This is the only traces, moving film we've got of these films, and you'll find it on the National Archives website. It's when Shirley's Hansom Cab came out. It was motorised traffic in Melbourne in those days, and they got out a real hansom cab from the mothballs, and they put a banner behind it, and they went driving around Melbourne to make publicity. And this was actually newsreel footage. It was newsworthy. And the very interesting thing about this is that it links very closely to what Hume did when his book came out. Because being a bit of a publishing man, being a bit of a self-advertiser himself, he hired a hansom cab for the day, and he delivered it to the bookstalls, his books, in a hansom cab, and then went driving around the suburbs as an advertisement. And I would bet you anything that he had a banner like that. And that this represents a kind of folk memory of what Hume did. And indeed, advertising was a major thing, even with the many successful plays of the Hansom Cab. In London, they had advertising for the Hansom Cab, and which they drove around with in a hansom cab with sandwich board men and a blood-stained corpse. In Fleet Street, mind you. They tried the same trick in Brisbane, and Brisbane did not go down well in Brisbane, and they took the hansom cab's driver his licence away for 2 weeks. But it was wondrous publicity. So we have a book that was wonderfully publicised, and yet became a success because of its publicity, and yet was very important because it helped create the publishing genre of crime fiction. A certain young man called Arthur Conan Doyle had written his Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes story. He couldn't get that out until after the Hansom Cab had been published in England, and even then he was disgusted that the Hansom Cab did very well and his book didn't. And he thought it was a piffling tale sold by advertising. But in a way, he had the last laugh because he only intended Sherlock Holmes to be his first Sherlock Holmes to be a one-off. But publishers kept on saying to him, "Oh, well, you've got a really good character in Sherlock Holmes. Why don't you write another? Look at the success of the Hansom Cab." And so he did. And he got into the Strand magazine, and the rest is history. His career really took off. Hume never had quite the same degree of success. Conan Doyle was the real winner in terms of popularity, ultimately. But the Hansom Cab has endured. It's never really been out of print. It was reprinted by Text Classic. Hume would have been considerably surprised that it was considered as a classic, but somewhere, and he believed in reincarnation. I hope he's pleased that it has been accorded classic status. And I'll stop at this point and take questions.
Thank you so much, Lucy. We do have time for about 10 minutes-ish of questions. If you have a question, I'll come around with the mic.
Did Murder on the Orient Express come out of the same public transport genre?
It wouldn't surprise me. Agatha Christie would have read Hume. Everybody read Hume, so it doesn't surprise me at all. There was indeed a Murder on a Tram published the year after Hume's book, and that was set in Sydney. So there was a definite theme of public transport.
Thanks for that. You mentioned these writers connected with the police or the criminal world or mental illness or the legal fraternity. I wonder if you can comment on what makes a good writer of crime.
Sorry, I've had a bit of trouble hearing that.
So my question is, what makes a good writer of crime?
Well, if you look at Hume, he had a legal background. He'd written for theatre, so he was good at dialogue. He was highly intelligent, so he could read 11 crime books and immediately see how you did it, and realise the importance of plotting. I think it helps sort of if a writer is observant and that they've got a good imagination, but they've got a sense of credibility of what's believable, and also that they can research, because if you can't, because depend on it, if you manage to get anything wrong with guns in a crime novel, you will get letters telling you where you've made the mistake. It's quite famous.
Lucy, I'm really interested in hearing you talk a little more about plotting. When you were constructing Blockbuster, were you feeling the influence? Were you feeling Hume's sense of plotting? Was that guiding you in some way?
I think I learnt a lot about narrative, but I did a few unusual things because there was so much material on the Hansom Cab. I couldn't do a straight biography, and the thing about Hume is there's no diaries. I can't interview him, even except via séance maybe. There's very few letters and very few publishers' records, but there was enough material from digitised newspapers about the Hansom Cab alone, so that I could turn this into a biography of a book. Partly because the most success was the beginning of his life, the Hansom Cab. And the last 30 years of his life were not great biographical material, although he was living very quietly in a village in Essex and slowly sinking into genteel poverty, but continuing writing. And I really didn't want to consider that too much. It seemed sad, but then I thought, no. So I put that right at the end in an appendix. So I had the story of the Hansom Cab, but then I also considered it as a rare book. And it's because it's the first edition, there's only 4 copies surviving. So it's of interest to the rare book interest. And so I had a whole entire chapter describing the rare book field and the importance of Hume to that, because along with the study in Scarlet, the Hansom Cab is one of the crime fiction collectibles. But then people kept on asking me if Hume was gay. And after about the 3rd time, I thought, well, I'd better look into this. And so I had an entire chapter on that as well. So it's not perhaps the conventional structure. And then I had a postscript. And then I had what happened to all the people mentioned in the story. And then I also looked at the fall of marvellous Melbourne, because that is crucial, because Hume depicted the boomtown city at its peak, and then in the 1890s they had a subprime crisis and the city went into depression and was never quite the same again. So you had to think of all this information and how to order it, but I felt I couldn't do a straight biography unless, say, somebody comes out of the blue and says, oh hello, I've got this cache of 200 letters that Hume wrote to my great-grandfather. If something like that happened, then I'd have to do a new edition.